Germans never knew American VT Fuzes shot down 82% of their V-1s in one day. Late August 1944. Observation Post 4, Pardal, France. The morning report lay crumpled on the desk as German technical officers at Flak Regiment 155W struggled to comprehend the mathematics before them. The interception rates violated every principle of ballistic probability ever taught at Luftwaffe technical academies across the Reich. It could not be accurate. Through their field telescopes, German observers had witnessed something that contradicted everything their intelligence services had assured them about Allied anti-aircraft capabilities. The V-1 flying bombs, launched toward London in the pre-dawn hours, were being destroyed at rates that defied explanation. They were not being shot down by fighters making dangerous pursuit curves. They were not being snagged by barrage balloon cables. Instead, they were being destroyed by anti-aircraft fire over the coastal gun belt. Shells were exploding with impossible accuracy around the missiles, somehow detonating near them rather than requiring direct hits. At Flak Regiment 155W headquarters in the Château de Leto, Oberst Max Wachtel, commander of the entire V-1 offensive, received these reports with growing alarm. Over the course of the German V-1 campaign, the proportion of flying bombs destroyed by the coastal gun belt had risen from 17% in June to 74% by late August, reaching a staggering 82% during one extraordinary day in that final week of August 1944. This marked the beginning of the most profound technological shock German weapons scientists would experience during the war. What neither Wachtel nor any German scientist knew was that they were witnessing the deployment of one of World War II's most closely guarded secrets, a technology so revolutionary that it was protected at the same security level as the atomic bomb project. This was the proximity fuse, or VT, variable time fuse, as the Allies codenamed it. And it was systematically destroying Hitler's terror weapon with a precision that German physics said should not exist. The story began 10 weeks earlier, on June 13, 1944, exactly 1 week after D-Day. In response to the Allied invasion of Normandy, Hitler had unleashed his long-promised Vergeltungswaffe, the vengeance weapon, against London. At 4:25 a.m. on June 13th, the first V-1 struck London, landing on Grove Road in Bow. It destroyed a railway bridge and nearby homes. 6 people were killed, 30 injured, and 200 left homeless. The weapon represented years of German development, a pilotless aircraft powered by an Argus AS-109.014 pulse jet engine carrying 850 kilograms of amytal at 640 kilometers per hour. It was the world's first operational cruise missile, and the German High Command believed it would bring Britain to its knees. Major Walter Dornberger, head of the V-weapons program at Peenemünde, calculated that even with a conservative 25% success rate, the V-1 would deliver more explosive power to London than the entire Blitz of 1940-1941. Each V-1 cost approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks to produce, a fraction of the cost of a manned bomber mission and with no risk to aircrew. At Peenemünde Army Research Center, German scientists had reason for confidence. They had already developed advanced rocket technology, created operational jet aircraft, and now fielded the first cruise missile. Dr. Robert Lusser, who designed the V-1's control system, calculated that Allied interception was nearly impossible. The flying bomb traveled at 640 kilometers per hour at varying altitudes between 600 and 2,700 meters. British fighters needed speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour to intercept. To destroy one, a pilot had to close within 200 meters, close enough to risk destruction from the blast.
As for anti-aircraft fire, the probability of a direct hit on such a small, fast target was calculated at less than 1 in 10,000 shells fired. This was not propaganda, but solid ballistic science. Conventional time-fused shells required accurate prediction, precise calculation, manual fuse setting, and perfect timing. Against the speed of a V-1, gunners had perhaps 30 seconds from detection to engagement. Oberst Max Wachtel, commanding Flak Regiment 155W, knew these limitations well from both sides of anti-aircraft warfare. During the campaign, Germans would launch 9,521 V-1 missiles from ground sites against England, with thousands more against other targets, bringing the total to approximately 25,000 V-1 missiles deployed during the war. But within days of the first launches, troubling reports began reaching German intelligence. British anti-aircraft defenses were adapting with suspicious speed. By late June, the interception rate climbed from 10% to 24%. Higher than predicted, yes, but still explainable. Then came July, and the statistics became inexplicable. German technical officers monitoring effectiveness noticed British guns claiming V-1 kills with impossibly low ammunition expenditure. Observers on the French coast witnessed V-1s flying steadily toward England, suddenly surrounded by flak bursts, then tumbling from the sky, despite explosions occurring too far away for direct hits. Unknown to German intelligence, they were witnessing the first combat use of proximity fuses, devices that turned near misses into lethal strikes. The technology had already been operational in the Pacific since January 1943, when USS Helena shot down a Japanese dive bomber with shells that exploded upon sensing proximity to the target. But the German intelligence failure was comprehensive. The famous Oslo report of November 1939 had briefly mentioned proximity fuse research, but German scientists dismissed it as Allied disinformation. Germany had attempted to develop similar technology. More than 30 different designs were researched, but none achieved operational status. German engineers had concluded that proximity fuses were simply impossible. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. Miniaturizing radio transmitters and receivers for artillery shells, making vacuum tubes survive 20,000 G-forces, creating batteries that could activate after years of storage, and achieving mass production. Yet by August 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 VT fuses daily. And by the final week of that month, the proximity fuse was achieving its maximum effectiveness.
The technology had already been operational in the Pacific since January 1943, when USS Helena shot down a Japanese dive bomber with shells that exploded upon sensing proximity to the target. But the German intelligence failure was comprehensive. The famous Oslo report of November 1939 had briefly mentioned proximity fuse research, but German scientists dismissed it as Allied disinformation. Germany itself had attempted to develop similar technology. More than 30 different designs were studied, but none reached operational status. German engineers concluded that proximity fuses were impossible to realize. The challenges were immense. Miniaturizing radio transmitters and receivers to fit inside a shell, making fragile vacuum tubes withstand 20,000 times the force of gravity, developing batteries that could remain dormant for years then activate instantly, and ensuring consistent mass production. The United States, however, achieved all of this. By 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses daily. By late August 1944, these fuses were being deployed in the greatest concentrations ever seen. The British coastal gun belt defending London had been reorganized and reinforced with the explicit purpose of countering the V-1 threat. In June 1944, only 92 heavy anti-aircraft guns defended the Thames estuary. By July, that number had grown to more than 1,000 guns, carefully arranged in layered belts designed to cover every possible approach route of the flying bombs. These guns were connected by radar, sound locators, and centralized fire control systems. With proximity fuses, each 3.7-inch or 90mm shell no longer needed a perfect calculation. It simply needed to come within 25 meters of the target. When the V-1 entered this zone, the shell's tiny radio transmitter detected the change in reflected signal strength and automatically detonated. The effect was devastating. Near misses became kills. For the gun crews, the difference was immediately visible. Instead of shells bursting harmlessly behind or ahead of the V-1, detonations occurred directly beside the missiles. Pilots of interception squadrons often reported seeing V-1s break apart in mid-air from bursts that did not appear to strike directly. By mid-July, the British Anti-Aircraft Command was claiming destruction rates far higher than predicted. In 1 week, over 70% of incoming V-1s were destroyed by ground fire alone. The German reaction. In occupied France, Oberst Max Wachtel's staff at Flak Regiment 155W reviewed the data in disbelief. Their own testing had shown interception to be mathematically impossible. Yet here were the results. London was being spared devastation at an accelerating rate. German intelligence units scrambled to explain it. Reports were sent up the chain to the Luftwaffe High Command. Theories were floated. Perhaps the British had developed a new type of radar-directed predictor, or perhaps their gunners had become supernaturally skilled. Some even speculated that the RAF was secretly fielding new fighters beyond the speed capabilities of the Messerschmitt 262 jet. But the real answer, the existence of proximity fuses, never crossed their minds. German scientific culture in the 1940s, brilliant as it was in rocketry and jet propulsion, had dismissed the possibility outright. And so, as the summer of 1944 wore on, Hitler's vengeance weapon campaign began to fail. For Londoners, the V-1 campaign was still terrifying. Each missile carried nearly a ton of explosives, and the distinctive buzz of its pulse jet engine became a sound of dread. When the engine cut out, silence fell for a few seconds, then came the explosion. Between June 13th and September 5th, 1944, a total of 6,725 V-1s were launched against London. Of these, 2,340 reached the city. They killed 6,184 civilians and injured more than 17,000. But without the proximity fuse, the toll would have been catastrophic. British estimates suggested that interception rates without the new technology would have remained at 10 to 20%. With the fuses, combined with radar and fighter interception, destruction rates soared to over 80% by late August. Churchill himself was briefed on the results and remarked that the invention ranked alongside radar and the code-breaking of Enigma as one of the war's decisive technologies.
Origins of the fuse. The story of the proximity fuse did not begin in Britain, however, but in the United States. In 1940, the U.S. National Defense Research Committee established Section T to investigate the problem of creating a radio fuse. The work was led by Dr. Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. Tuve and his team pioneered the miniaturization of vacuum tubes, developing rugged designs capable of surviving the enormous acceleration forces inside an artillery shell. They also perfected a clever battery system, a tiny reserve battery that remained inert until the shell was fired, when the force of acceleration triggered it into operation. By late 1941, prototypes were working reliably. By 1942, the U.S. Navy began testing the fuses in anti-aircraft shells. The results were astonishing. For the first time in history, gunners could fire at fast-moving aircraft with a realistic chance of destroying them. In January 1943, the USS Helena scored the world's first proximity fuse kill, downing a Japanese dive bomber with shells that exploded merely near the target. From that point, the technology was considered one of America's greatest military secrets. President Roosevelt personally restricted information about the fuse to an extremely small circle of Allied leaders. It was classified at the same level as the Manhattan Project. So vital was secrecy that when the British requested to use the fuse over German soil in 1943, Roosevelt refused. He feared that unexploded shells might fall into German hands and allow their scientists to copy the invention. Only when the V-1 campaign began in June 1944, threatening London itself, did the restriction ease. Roosevelt authorized their use over England, reasoning that the desperate situation outweighed the risk of capture. Thus, by late summer 1944, the German High Command was watching its vengeance weapon campaign collapse without ever understanding why. By August 30th, 1944, V-1 launches from France ceased entirely. Allied armies were overrunning the Pas-de-Calais sites, and German planners shifted to air-launched V-1s, a desperate and largely ineffective substitute. But the technological shock of the proximity fuse had only just begun, for soon it would prove decisive not only against the V-1s, but on the battlefields of Europe themselves. Part 3. The tension in the courtroom doesn't ease as the session moves forward. Judge Fleischer turns his attention to yet another defendant, a man facing probation violations tied to his history with DWI charges. His tone shifts between stern authority and careful instruction, as if he's reminding the defendant that the justice system is not just about punishment, but also about choices and consequences. This moment serves as a powerful reminder that probation is not a free pass. It's a structured second chance, one that demands accountability at every step. For the viewers watching, it's a lesson worth reflecting on. How often do people squander opportunities by underestimating the weight of their commitments? The commentary highlights how the judge balances empathy with responsibility. On one hand, he acknowledges the difficulty of overcoming substance-related struggles. On the other, he makes it crystal clear that excuses hold no ground in a court of law. His words echo beyond the bench, almost like a warning to anyone tempted to take probation lightly. This dual approach captures the essence of real courtroom drama. It's not just about rulings, but about life-altering moments of reckoning. As the exchange unfolds, you can feel the quiet but sharp energy in the room, each sentence carrying both a caution and a call for accountability. And for the audience following along, it begs the question, what would you do if granted one last chance to set things right? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. And if these real-life lessons resonate with you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more courtroom insights.
Only when the V-1 campaign began in June 1944, threatening London itself, did Roosevelt authorize the use of proximity fuses over British soil. The decision came with enormous risk. If even a single shell landed intact, German scientists might recover the device and leap years ahead in their weapons research. But the urgency of protecting London outweighed the danger. By August 1944, the technology was not only stopping V-1 flying bombs, it was about to change the very nature of ground warfare in Europe. In September 1944, as Allied forces advanced into Belgium and the Netherlands, the proximity fuse began to be issued to field artillery units. Until then, it had been restricted primarily to naval and anti-aircraft use. Now, American and British gunners would discover its terrifying effectiveness against troops in open terrain. Traditional artillery shells with time or impact fuses had significant limitations. A time fuse required precise calculation to detonate above a target, often wasting shells if the timing was off. Impact fuses required direct hits on the ground, which often meant shells buried themselves before exploding, reducing their lethal effect. The proximity fuse eliminated both problems. Fired into the air, shells would automatically detonate at the optimal height above enemy troops, showering the ground with deadly fragments. Against soldiers in the open, it was devastating.
The first large-scale use occurred during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. When German forces launched their surprise Ardennes offensive, U.S. artillery equipped with VT fuses played a critical role in halting the advance. German infantry, massed in snowy fields and forest clearings, suddenly found themselves under artillery fire that seemed unnaturally precise. Shells burst above their heads, not behind or in front, cutting down attackers in terrifying numbers. General George S. Patton would later remark that the proximity fuse was the most important new development in the war. Eisenhower called it one of the 4 decisive weapons of the Allied victory, along with radar, code breaking, and the atomic bomb. German shock and ignorance. On the receiving end, German soldiers were baffled. They had endured years of artillery fire, but nothing like this. Survivor accounts describe panic and disbelief at shells exploding in the air as if they knew exactly where we were. Once again, German intelligence had no explanation. They speculated about new types of fragmentation shells or special tactics, but never grasped that a miniature radio device was hidden inside each round. Even when fragments of fuses were recovered from battlefields, the pieces were too damaged to reveal their secret. By the time the war ended, the Germans had failed to reproduce anything comparable. The proximity fuse was not a rare wonder weapon. It was produced in massive numbers. Between 1942 and 1945, Allied factories manufactured more than 22 million VT fuses. Entire industrial sectors in the U.S. were devoted to their production. The project mobilized some of the brightest scientific minds of the Allied nations. Laboratories worked around the clock to refine designs, improve ruggedness, and scale up production. Workers, many of them women recruited during the war, assembled delicate vacuum tubes under strict secrecy. To maintain security, workers were told they were building radio parts without being told the purpose. Few realized their labor was producing one of the war's deadliest innovations. By the end of World War II, the proximity fuse had saved countless lives by blunting enemy offensives and reducing the effectiveness of German V-weapons. Churchill himself ranked it alongside radar and the Enigma codebreakers as a decisive factor in ensuring Allied victory. After the war, the technology became standard in militaries worldwide, evolving into modern electronic and digital fuses still in use today. But in 1944 to 45, it was more than a technological achievement. It was a weapon that reshaped the battlefield. For the men who faced the V-1s over London and the artillery barrages in the Ardennes, it was the difference between survival and destruction. And for Oberst Max Wachtel and his staff back in 1944, staring at impossible interception rates that defied all their calculations, it was a mystery they would never solve.